now. Okay, thank you again, everybody, for coming. And today we have another seminar for the Global English series. This time with Marcella Caprario, who is from the Wenzhou-Kean University, and she's going to present something which is very close to my interests because the topic today is going to be reconceptualizing pragmatic competence in global English communication and pedagogy. So I'm really excited for this topic. Thank you again, Marcella, for giving us this opportunity. And let's just hear it from you. We can start whenever we want, whenever you want. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Paolo and Mona, both of you, for organizing this series and inviting me to share some of my thoughts and my research and my ideas. I'm very excited, actually, at the opportunity to share this presentation, the seminar, with everybody that's here. I will talk for a while, but I will ask you to share some of your own thoughts in the chat from time to time. So I hope that you will be willing to actively engage, and then I will leave some time for Q&A and discussion at the end. So I am going to start by defining and conceptualizing pragmatics from a traditional standpoint. And this is because I'm not really sure everyone's background, and pragmatics is kind of a slippery concept. And so I want us to all start out on the same page. Then I will very briefly describe what is meant by global English communication, so the paradigm of global Englishes, and specifically English as a lingua franca. And that will lead me then to the main argument, which is reconceptualizing pragmatics in ELF communication, and then how we can take that reconceptualization and apply it to language teaching. So starting with the first topic, the traditional view. I am curious before I start what people hear, how you define pragmatics, what people think of pragmatics. So if you're willing, I'll give you a minute to share some ideas in the chat. If someone just asks you, on the street, how do you define pragmatics? Could you explain that? How do you explain it to your students? How do you explain this idea of what is pragmatics? So I know it takes a little time to type, so I'll give us a few minutes. Oh, great. I see lots of people already. Yeah, language and context. That's a good one. I'm trying to open the chat, but I cannot seem to see it. I saw the messages pop up and disappear, but I cannot actually open the full chat.
I can read it
But I
for
saw
you.
something.
I can read it for you.
Huh?
Some people said
Can you read it? Yeah.
appropriate communication. Some people said meaning that is not directly given through the words, language in context, efficiency.
Really good to see that we all have a kind of sense of pragmatics as contextual beyond the language level in terms of words, phrases, pronunciation. So here's a definition from David Crystal, who defines pragmatics as the choices that we make, the constraints that we encounter when we use language in social interaction, and the effects that language has on other people. So this takes some of what you all were typing in the chat into account, right? It has this idea of appropriateness with other people, social interaction, the effects that it has, so maybe making things easier or not. What's interesting to me about this definition is that it's very focused on the creator of the message, the speaker, right? The choices that I, as a speaker, am making, the constraints I, as a speaker, am encountering, the effects that my language has on other people. It's sort of one-sided. There's another definition from Jenny Thomas around the same time, which gets closer to how I'm conceptualizing pragmatics in global Englishes. And that is looking at pragmatics as meaning in interaction, and that this is a dynamic process, that it involves negotiation of meaning between speaker and hearer. So it's not a one-sided thing. Here is the idea. Context of the utterance is important, not only the social context, but also the physical context. So like right now, we are in this online platform, and that will impact the way that we communicate, and also the linguistic context, what has already been said. And finally, the meaning potential of an utterance. So everything that we say has probably, maybe always or almost always, more than one possible meaning, right? That's the meaning potential. What I say can have multiple meanings. And how do we know which meaning I'm intending? Well, again, that involves that dynamic process of negotiation of meaning and taking into account the context. So this definition of pragmatics applies to all communication, not just global Englishes, but it gets close to also my own conception of global English's pragmatics being dynamic and negotiated. So when we conceptualize pragmatics, one way that people have traditionally thought about pragmatics is through locution, illocution, and perlocution. This may be a review back to your maybe intro to linguistics classes, but it's this idea that what we say, the words and the grammar, right, that's the locution, but then they have a meaning, which some of you already put in the chat, that it's this idea of the meaning beyond the words and the grammar, what people actually mean. And then perlocution is the impact of that utterance on the interlocutor. And so just to give a quick example, this is a very classic exchange in US classrooms. So a student asks the teacher, "Can I go to the bathroom?" And the teacher says, "I don't know, can you?" And so here, the meaning potential of "can I go to the bathroom," it can mean, do I have permission? But it can also mean, do I have the ability? So there's two different meaning potentials. Of course, we know the student is most likely, the illocutionary force is asking for permission, right? But the perlocutionary effect is not to get permission. It is the teacher saying, "I don't know, can you?" So what is the teacher doing here? So the illocutionary force here is not, "I really want to know whether you are able to use the bathroom." Illocutionary force is, "I want you to reformulate, can I?" And so the student then understands and changes to "may I?" and finally gets the permission. So we can see locution, the words that were said are not really what was meant, the illocution. And we can also see that the receiver of the message in both cases understood, and finally the perlocutionary effect matched the illocutionary force. So this shows us how we're using context, right? And how we're co-constructing. Okay. So what is included in pragmatics? Speech acts, like we just for permission, implicature and inference, we just saw also that was happening in that teacher-student exchange, indexicality, so referring to people and places and things, politeness, appropriateness, and other things. Pragmatics is a very large area of linguistics, which is also why it can be a bit slippery. So another way to conceptualize beyond locution, illocution, perlocution is the idea of pragmalinguistic and sociopragmatic aspects of communication. So pragmalinguistic aspects are these form function mappings. So again, with a request, we have phrases like "can you," "would you," "could I trouble you to," and various other ones. So these groupings of words and grammatical structures map onto the function of asking, right, making a request. Sociopragmatic aspects are the cultural values like politeness and appropriateness. So when we think about "can you," "would you," "could I trouble you to," which one would we use with a friend, with a waiter, with a professor, right? We might not, if we need the professor to do something, we might not say, "Can you check this?" We might say, "Excuse me, could I trouble you to," right? Because that's a more formal situation. And then it's not just who we're talking to, but we would probably use different pragmalinguistic forms if we're asking to borrow a pen versus getting a ride home versus, I don't know, asking to borrow $100, right? We change. And so this is another way of kind of conceptualizing how we understand pragmatics and how we teach pragmatics. And so this leads me to teaching pragmatics, and I'm going to ask for your participation one more time. Do you teach pragmatics if you are a language teacher? If you do, what do you teach? What kinds of things do you teach your students? Or if you are a language educator, a teacher educator, what kinds of things do you encourage teachers to teach? So anybody that teaches, I'm curious. I wonder if we have language teachers in here. Maybe not. Mhm.
I see somebody saying yes, pragmatics are not governed by one specific culture. I see people saying
Pragmatics are not
pragmatics are not
governed by one
governed.
specific. Mm, that's a really good thing to teach. That is part of what I'll be talking about. Polite forms. Okay. Yeah. Polite forms. That's something. Yeah. Politeness. Okay. Yes, I teach English. Okay. A lot. Okay. I'm an EAP teacher. A lot of it is how to do this, particularly in an academic setting. Yes. So the norms of the academic setting, how to be appropriate in that context. Okay. Great. So these are the things that are very commonly included in course books. Appropriateness. But as Mona mentioned in the chat, what do we mean by appropriateness? Because we are maybe getting a little ahead of ourselves, but we are from different cultures using English, right? But in a traditional view, oh, in a traditional view, the pedagogical focus is often on standardized pragma linguistic phrases. So, what is the appropriate, I put it in quotes, what is the appropriate way to apologize? What is the polite way to, I don't know, write an email to a professor? And so, a lot of times in course books, we see kind of lists of phrases that students can learn. That's that form function mapping. The most frequently taught pragmatics topics, according to Taguchi, and when they looked at a variety of research and pedagogical focused sources, are speech acts and routine formulae. And actually, speech acts and routine formulae overlap. So I have some examples. Yeah, but that is a routine formula for the speech act of disagreeing, right? So if I want to disagree politely, I might say, yeah, but I also think something else, right? Routine formulae can also be greetings, like how are you, fine, thank you, and you, right? That we sort of memorize and have our students memorize. So these are frequently taught. Why? Because they're easy to teach, right? They lend themselves to a very clear cut explanation. Students can memorize them, regurgitate them on a test. When sociopragmatics topics are included in typical kind of English language teaching materials, they normally center an L1 normative position that's relying on the cultural expectations in standardized varieties. So when we say I'm teaching politeness in English, for a lot of us, if we're using a traditional course book or relying on sort of traditional way of teaching English language, politeness means in terms of a standardized variety, normally attributed to the UK or the US. So this idea that we have people using English all over the world from different cultures, but when we teach in a kind of traditional way, we're relying on these standardized pragmalinguistic phrases and standardized socio-pragmatic cultural ideas. And so pragmatic competence in that way of looking is often understood as the ability to deploy pragmalinguistic language that is appropriate to the situation based on a standardized view. This is what I want to argue against. I know not everyone is doing this, but in the majority of cases, this is still, at least to my knowledge, what is done in a lot of English language classrooms and certainly in the course books. So I want to refer briefly here to this entry in the Encyclopedia of Applied Linguistics that I co-authored with Naoko Taguchi, because here is where we lay out an argument against using L1 pragmatic norms as a benchmark. So we were talking about researchers using L1 norms as a benchmark for kind of measuring pragmatic ability or pragmatic gains, but this also applies to teaching and assessment of pragmatics. So the first thing I've sort of hinted at already, and some of you did as well, and that is that we are questioning whether L1 pragmatic norms even exist, right? They're certainly not static. We all know that language changes all the time, and they're certainly not uniform. So, one issue is that we are aware of macro social factors that can impact pragmatic choices, even for people that are from the same country and even from the same part of that country. So, for example, I'm a New Yorker. I'm not young. I won't say how old I am, but if you ask someone my age, a New Yorker my age, and you ask a young New Yorker, maybe in her 20s, what is appropriate, what is polite, you may get different answers, even though we're from the same place and we are L1 users of English, because age impacts this change over time. But also region. New Yorkers in the US have a reputation for being rude. We don't think we're rude, but people from other parts of the country often feel that way because our norms are different. Gender, socioeconomic status, educational level, many factors can impact pragmatic choices. So when we say L1 norms, which L1 speaker? There isn't a uniform norm, even within one country or one region. And then, of course, there are microsocial factors, which we've talked about already, in terms of the relationship. How formal do I need to be? How well do I know someone? Sometimes those things are taught, but very rarely in the traditional view do we question the idea of the L1 norm as a real thing. The second problem that we discuss in this chapter is that learner agency should be respected. And so when we teach pragmatic norms and our students don't behave the way that we're expecting of them, it might not be because they didn't understand or they didn't learn it, they didn't remember. They may very well understand what they've been taught, but they may feel uncomfortable enacting those norms because they can go against the learner's own values and beliefs. And there's an interesting article. It's a little bit old now, but I like this article. Brown 2013 talks about a German learner of Korean. So this person is German, born and raised, associates with the identity of German. They are of Korean heritage and they're learning Korean. And they talk about the honorific system in Korean, which is hierarchical. And the learner understands this honorific system very well, but the learner refuses to use it because they feel uncomfortable. They feel as a German that they want communication to be more egalitarian. And so that's the way that they explain it, that their own German culture makes them not want to embrace this part of the Korean pragmatic system. And so other German learners may feel differently, other Korean speakers may feel differently, but for that speaker, this was something that was not aligned with their own identity. And so through their agency, they did not want to enact those norms. And so that's another argument against using L1 pragmatic norms as the benchmark. Finally, standardized norms may be irrelevant in global context. And so I'll be moving to talking more about global context in just a moment. And so if we think about users of English all over the world, for example, let's say a Japanese speaker of English and an Italian speaker of English are speaking together, there are no L1 English speakers present. And so why do they need to enact norms that are not natural to either one of them? It's not necessarily something that is relevant or important, and in some cases can even make communication more difficult. So with that in mind, I move very briefly to the second topic, which is global English communication and English as a lingua franca, again, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So the global Englishes paradigm, which Nicola Galloway has explained in multiple papers, but particularly in this recent TESOL Quarterly article, she's describing how the concept of global Englishes is an umbrella term that is meant to bring together other research areas that share values and share some aims. So bringing together world Englishes, English as an international language, English as a lingua franca, translanguaging, multilingualism, all under kind of one umbrella. These are different areas, right? They do different things, but they are aligned in many ways. And so the idea is that the boundaries can be permeable between these different research areas because they all have an aim to guide English language teaching away from strict adherence to L1 norms. So I bolded strict adherence because it doesn't mean we don't teach L1 norms. I think that at least in today's world, teachers cannot escape it. Students have to take standardized tests. We have standardized curricula, but we can move away from strict adherence. We can be flexible. We can help students to understand that they don't need to approximate those norms all the time. The Global Englishes paradigm encourages inclusive pedagogy. that reflects real world English use. So I just talked about how these L1 pragmatic norms, in my view, are not real, right? They've been invented based on the way that maybe certain groups of people do use English, looking at groups that have power and prestige. But still, I think no one really speaks the way we teach this kind of standardized pragmatics. And so instead of doing that, Global Englishes is encouraging a pedagogy that looks at how people really use English in a global sense and tries to help students learn communicative skills that will help them with their actual communication. And finally, recognizing the pluricentricity of English is really important. So in the modern world, there is not just one center of English, right? It's not just coming from England or from the UK and the US, but instead it has many centers all over the world. And so people from a lot of different linguocultural backgrounds use English for different purposes, and often without the presence of L1 English speakers. So specifically English as a lingua franca, you can see a definition here on the screen. So basically a tool for people who don't share other languages to communicate through English as a shared language. It's often characterized by lexical creativity, sometimes non-standard grammar, of course, varied accents, people from many different backgrounds, and also English as a lingua franca is intercultural communication by definition, so we see varied cultural norms and expectations from different interlocutors during communication. And so in this kind of situation, pragmatics become even more important for effective communication. Pragmatics are always important. We're not always aware of them, but they really drive the success of our communication or lack thereof. But when you are in a situation where there's so much variation, it becomes even more important to be able to communicate in ways that all of the interlocutors feel are appropriate. It's even more important to be able to negotiate meaning and to use the context to help us understand each other. So pragmatics allow adaptation of communication in response to contextual factors, including interlocutor identity, register, all of these different contextual factors. And pragmatic effectiveness can really mean the difference between rapport and conflict, between being understood and not understood. So moving to the third part of my seminar today, which is really what I want to focus on, is reconceptualizing pragmatics. And so taking the sort of traditional way of viewing pragmatics and pragmatic competence and thinking about how we might think differently about that in terms of ELF communication. So, what is pragmatics and ELF communication? This is the question I ask myself often. And there isn't one definition, just like there isn't one definition of pragmatics in general. But if we go back to the conceptualization we talked about earlier, in terms of pragmalinguistics, it doesn't really work because I just said that ELF is often characterized by lots of creativity and uses of English that are not considered standardized. So what kind of pragmalinguistics are we looking at? People may not be using the same words and phrases. If we look at socio-pragmatics, again, people are coming from different norms, different cultural norms, different expectations. So we don't have one kind of socio-pragmatic idea to look at. Whose norms? Appropriate to whom? Polite to whom? So we have to think about this. So this, I know it's a lot of text on the slide. I'll give you a minute to read for yourself, but I like the way that House describes this. So there's a few things I really like about this. I like this idea that the norms are not shared and they don't need to be. So we don't need to conform to one cultural norm. And that the surface is English. The linguistic surface is English, right? So we're using English as a tool for communication, but under the surface, there are many other languages present. There are many cultural backgrounds present. There are lots of different knowledge. So English language on the surface, but don't forget all those other things that people bring to communication. And then the idea that English speakers everywhere are creating their own discourse strategies, their own communication styles in their own use of ELF. So that this is always emergent. Makes it, again, slippery to define. So we need a conceptualization that reflects authentic ELF communication, that supports global English's informed pedagogy, allows for learner agency, and provides an alternative to these idealized L1 norms, which are rooted in native speakerism and coloniality. So I'm going to summarize two groups of scholars and then kind of bring that all together to suggest ways that we can think about this. So Kobo and House have put forth that accommodation is the prominent feature, prominent characteristic of ELF pragmatics. And accommodation is supported or facilitated by negotiation of meaning, use of interactional elements, and the use of multilingual resources. And if you're interested in the last one, you can see more of Kobo's work. She talks a lot about multilingual resources in English as a lingua franca. So I'm going to go through how they describe these three aspects of ELF pragmatic competence. So negotiation of meaning is facilitated by preemptive strategies. So these are communication strategies or pragmatic strategies that people use when no problem has happened, right? This is proactive. This is the idea that I want to avoid a communication breakdown, so I will raise explicitness. And so this can be accomplished in many ways, like repetition or reformulating an utterance to maybe make it clearer or simpler. Lots of different ways that people use preemptive strategies. Of course, repair strategies as well if communication breakdown has occurred. And co-construction of utterances, which allows speakers to build consensus and solidarity. And so here's an excerpt from their paper where you can see this co-construction happening. So speaker A says, the most of Chinese in foreign countries, they speak not Mandarin. They don't speak Mandarin, but can only these, and then cannot find the word, right? Dialects? Yes, dialects. And then the third person repeats dialects. And finally, again, dialects, they're dialects. And so in this way, they have co-constructed the utterance because speaker B has provided the word, speaker A has accepted the word, and then they have all shown that they have understood there's uptake happening. So this is a co-construction to build consensus and as well as building solidarity. So this is negotiation of meaning. This is the first way that they suggest accommodation can be achieved. Interactional elements. These are communicative aspects that allow us to manage interaction, like discourse markers, like so, well, right? These kinds of things, back channeling, like nodding and saying yes, as you listen. So we manage the flow of information, but we also manage interpersonal relations through these interactional elements. And one of the things, if you're interested in this, you can look at House's 2022 article, but she also has other publications where she has done research on the way that discourse markers are used in ELF communication. And sometimes they do differ in both form and function from that idea of standardized English. So they may change the form, like, for example, in my point of view, rather than from my point of view. It's a very minor change. And sometimes also the function. So the way that they use, I don't know, might be different from the way we describe it in a standardized English variety. So there is variation happening, but nonetheless, these discourse markers are effectively used to manage interaction in ELF communication. So once again, we see the idea of a difference from the standardized variety doesn't really cause problems. Finally, multilingual resources, so the use of other languages that are known to interlocutors. If you take a traditional SLA, the use of multilingual resources can be seen as a failure, that the student is not able to use English and they have to rely on their L1. But actually, in terms of ELF communication, this is seen as a strength. So multilingual resources can be used to co-construct meaning, according to Kogo and House, to share the sense of being non-native speakers within a context, and sharing membership in an intercultural community by translanguaging in and out of various L1s. And so this could be speakers using L1s that they know everyone involved in the communication has a little bit of knowledge of. And it can also look like, I speak Italian and my interlocutor speaks Spanish, and those languages are similar. So maybe it's a cognate. Let me give it a try and use my L1. And sometimes that can also facilitate communication. And that is seen as a pragmatic competence, as a strength. So here's another example from this 2018 chapter. I should give you a little bit of background before I show you that. So in this excerpt, they are talking about some wedding photos, and the people in the wedding, the bride and groom, are not there. Some people just looking at their photos, and they're criticizing the photos, saying that they're really over the top. They're too much. They're kind of ridiculous photos. And so speaker A says, yeah, a bit too much, I think, and laughs. And then speaker B, who is an L1 French speaker, says, so blue flower, we say, and then fleur bleue in French. Why? To say that it's cheesy. So this kind of slang English word cheesy. Yeah, fleur bleue means, when you kind of have these pictures with little angels and then, yeah. And then in the penultimate line, you see that speaker A, who is a German L1 speaker, says kitschig. And speaker B, the French speaker, confirms, kitschig, yeah, and laughs. So they may not be able to have an entire conversation in French or in German, but they have enough knowledge that they're able to translanguage and understand each other and make the idea of what speaker B is trying to say clearer. So from an ELF perspective, this is a very successful communication. And pragmatically, they are using different L1s, in addition to other things, to co-construct meaning and build solidarity and understand each other. So to recap, from Kogo and House research, accommodation is seen as pragmatic effectiveness in ELF, and it is facilitated by negotiation of meaning, the use of interactional elements, and multilingual resources. So I want to move on to one other article that I want to summarize from you, and then I'll kind of synthesize those. So this is Taguchi and Ishihara 2018. I love this article, not only because Taguchi was my PhD supervisor, but also because I think it's a really good article. They describe what they see as pragmatic competence in ELF, or a kind of beginning of trying to describe ELF pragmatic competence, but they also include recommendations for pedagogy, which I will come back around to in a little while. So they distill their ideas down to 4 points, 4 abilities. So the first is the ability to shape illocutionary force. Remember locution, illocution, perlocution? So the meaning behind the words, to shape illocutionary force according to the interlocutor's reactions. So that means the speaker, the sender of the message, is watching for how it is received and then potentially making some adjustments. So the ability to do that is a part of ELF pragmatic competence, and to jointly construct speech acts. So again, this kind of co-constructing. The ability to co-construct mutual norms and standards of what is appropriate and acceptable in a given situation without necessarily adhering to native speaker norms, without necessarily adhering. It doesn't mean they cannot. If they want to, they can, but they can flexibly adjust to each other. Ability to navigate the communicative demand skillfully by using communication strategies and discourse devices. So discourse devices goes back to Kogo and House, talking about these kind of discourse markers and back channeling, and then also communication strategies to achieve mutual understanding. And finally, the ability to display alignment with the interlocutor's linguistic acts and needs, developing shared discourse repertoire for rapport management. So the key terms here at the first one is the idea of shaping illocutionary force based on reactions. The second is about this together building up what is appropriate for us. What do we feel is appropriate if we are engaged in communication? The third is communication strategies for mutual understanding. And the fourth is about rapport management. So not only do we need to understand each other, but trying to manage relationships as well. That these 4 points are the core of what starts to be a conception of pragmatic competence in English as a lingua franca communication. And so when I see these ideas about shaping illocutionary force based on reactions and co-constructing, it makes me feel a little bit like a metaphor of testing the water. So, like, let's say you're going to take a bath, right? And you run the water, and then you don't just, I mean, maybe you do, but it seems a little reckless to me. I wouldn't just jump into the bathtub, right? I would test it. I might put my hand in and say, oh, that's a little too hot. I will add more cold water. Oh, that's a little too cold. I will add more hot. So you kind of test, right? This is the negotiation. And so this requires people during communication to be very aware of who they're talking to and very aware of how that person is reacting. So it's really a hearer focused communication style and a flexibility and willingness to accommodate. So again, we're back to accommodation. So if I take Kogo and House and Taguchi and Ishihara and I bring all those ideas together, I can summarize the beginning of the conception of elf pragmatic. So accommodation as pragmatic effectiveness, negotiation of meaning, which includes all of these things, communication strategies, co-constructing, managing illocutionary force. It's all part of negotiation of meaning in my view. Co-construction of norms, use of interactional elements, which then we have all these examples of discourse markers, back channeling, shared discourse repertoire. So this is very different from the conceptualization that I showed you at the beginning, right? We're not talking about pragmalinguistic form function mappings. We're not talking about socio-pragmatic norms that people need to learn and apply all the time, right? We're talking about a flexibility here with accommodation as the key word. And multilingual resources. Oh my gosh, I almost left off one of the most important ones, the use of multilingual resources. Okay, so I want to briefly mention a little bit more about pragmatic strategies because that is what I'm going to focus on when I turn to pedagogy in just a moment. So you saw on the previous slide, applying communication strategies as part of negotiation of meaning, right? So pragmatic strategies is one of the most productive areas of descriptive ELF research. There is a lot of research documenting how people using English as a lingua franca in various contexts have used different strategies successfully. And so this 2022 chapter by Jagdish Kaur kind of synthesizes a good amount of that research. And so that's what I'll be using to summarize this for you. So she calls them pragmatic strategies. People also call them communication strategies, communicative strategies. It's all the same thing. We have a terminology problem. These are crucial for supporting ELF communication because they facilitate meaning negotiation. They also can facilitate solidarity and rapport building. So for mutual understanding, again, this is a similar thing to what other scholars I've introduced have said. The focus is on preempting communication problems, raising explicitness. There are many strategies for that. In terms of solidarity building, most of the strategies rely on accommodation. So that's where co-constructing and translanguaging, these things are more about managing relationships, managing the rapport between people who are interacting. So in general, the field has kind of categorized strategies into these two main purposes, that they're used for mutual understanding and for promoting solidarity, although many strategies can be used for both purposes. The strategies need to be applied flexibly based on context. I mean, whenever you're talking about pragmatics, context has got to be in the air. That's a major part, which many of you already put into the chat earlier. So I think we're all clear on that. And so thinking about those strategies, let me bring you to the last section of the talk. And I hope we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So ELF-informed pedagogical implications. One is strategy instruction. So actually teaching ELF communication strategies in English language classrooms. Some other ideas are diversifying pedagogical models, raising awareness of meta-pragmatic knowledge, and general awareness of global Englishes. And so I will briefly touch on all of these, but I'll spend most of my time on the first one because that is where my research mainly focuses. So, in terms of ELF communication strategy instruction, there's actually very little empirical research at this point. It's really just an emerging area. But these are three articles you can look at. So, it's my own article in TESOL Quarterly. There's Cordia 2020 and Milliner and Dmowski 2024. And I'll briefly summarize each of these because each one has some ideas that can be used directly in teaching. So in my study, I looked at a mix of LX, so students who learned English as an additional language, and L1 students, all university students studying at a university in the United States. And so I created some instructional materials based on publicly available ELF corpora. And so the students heard and read some excerpts from corpora, and then I provided them with a guided discovery handout, which asked them to kind of analyze these excerpts and figure out what's going on. Then I led them in a meta-pragmatic discussion, and then I offered them some opportunities to practice. And I'll actually show you what some of those activities look like in just a moment. I also tested them before and after the intervention, and I developed two assessments. One is a receptive assessment, so they're listening and they are showing whether they understand the strategies that they hear. And the other is a productive spoken interaction where they needed to complete a spoken task together. And then I developed two ELF-informed rubrics to measure their ELF pragmatic competence before and after instruction on that task. So those scoring rubrics are also available as appendices in the TESOL quarterly article if that's something that you think might be useful for you. This did not have a control or comparison group, so that's one of the limitations, but I do have another article hopefully coming out soon. I'm making revisions now, which is actually a larger study based on this pilot where I did have a control group and the results were a little different. So maybe look out for that article if you are interested in this topic. So I'm going to try to share another screen. Oh boy, I don't know if I can do this on this thing. Am I still sharing my screen?
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, still sharing. Yeah.
How do I stop sharing the screen? I don't see the menu anymore. So maybe I won't be able to show you. Um, hmm.
We can still see right now. We can see your screen.
No, but I want to show you a different screen. I want to show you. So can you see anything else now? What?
No, we still see the old one, the old
Yeah, see,
screen.
that's what I'm saying. If I can't change it. Okay, here it
To a
is.
different.
Okay, I found it.
Okay.
Stop screen sharing. Start screen sharing. Okay, I found it. Entire screen. And I'm going to do this one. Okay, because I want to show an example for those of you who are teaching.
Okay.
Can you see now a
Yeah.
handout?
Yeah.
Do you see it, Paolo?
Yeah. We can
Okay,
see it.
perfect. So here's an example of the teaching materials that I've developed. Great, thank you so much. So you can see this is drawn from the Asian Corpus of English, which is a free, publicly available online corpus. And I asked the students to read and listen to these conversations. So they are authentic audio that accompany these um, uh, transcripts. And then I asked them first to just notice without any instruction at all. Do you notice that the speakers are doing anything that could preempt or overcome communication problems? And they have a little bit of background information. Then they read and hear a brief exchange. And then we go on to the next one. So there are a few where I'm just asking them, what do you notice? Just listen and see if you notice anything. Then we go back for step two, which is asking them to go back now with some guidance and analyze what they have seen in the transcript. So the first question asks them if they've noticed any communication difficulty. If there's not, they don't need to answer this question. But if they do see some kind of what they perceive as difficulty, then they're asked to identify where it's happening, identify how they know it's a problem, what's going on, who is taking responsibility. It's often both or all interlocutors. And then most importantly, what did they do in the text? Circle the strategy. So I want them to actually see what was said that was overcoming this problem or attempting to overcome the problem. Then I asked them to also see if there's anything that speakers have done to prevent communication problems. So do they notice anything that looks like, maybe someone has self-paraphrased or repeated something? And again, what did they do? Circle the strategies. Finally, I asked them, were the speakers successful? So that has to be their opinion based on what they see and hear. Does it seem that it was successful? And how do you know? What evidence do you see? What makes you say that? So I'm really trying to sensitize them to become, sort of researchers in a way, in a small way, to try to see what's going on in communication. And so they answer this for all of the excerpts that I provided. And then finally, I provide them with the actual kind of names from the research of the strategies that I'm teaching with a definition, and they can match these. So if any of the strategies they circled match these definitions, they can label it with an A or a B. And they undoubtedly find other strategies that are not represented by these two. But at least then I can bring their attention to the ones that I'm explicitly teaching. On this day, it was confirmation, request, and explication. On other days, it was other strategies. So this is what I mean by guided discovery. I guide them to discover the strategies that are being used. But in the end, I do kind of give them my answer. I make it explicit, and then we discuss it in a meta-pragmatic discussion about other ways that these strategies can be achieved and other ways that we can do this. Okay, so now I need to find my way back to stop sharing and oops, start sharing again. Sorry, guys, I'm not used to this platform.
No
Okay,
worries, Marcella.
I'm almost there. I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. Okay.
Perfect.
You see it? Okay. All right. So that was the guided discovery handout. I will show you one example practice task. I have many that I developed, but in this case, each student was given a secret role to use. And that is one of the communication strategies that I explicitly taught. And so it would be a little slip of paper that looked like this. So your role is to clarify yourself. I can no longer see my own slides, so I need to look at my other screen. Okay, your role is to clarify yourself by self-paraphrasing at least twice, but don't tell your group members, it's a secret. And then the group is given a task. So this particular one was in an intercultural communications class. So I was trying to also make them draw on the reading they had done towards the beginning of the semester. So come up with a definition of culture. They have a little space where they can write it, and then they tack it to the wall, and then we can do a little gallery walk and see what everyone has put. But in the meantime, during the task of coming up with that definition, they are communicating, they're having an authentic communication about course content. But the little inauthentic part is I want them to intentionally use a specific strategy to get them thinking about how to intentionally use strategies during communication. There's a little debrief that happens after that as well. Okay, so that's one example of how ELF communication strategies can be incorporated into instruction. In Cordia's study, it's a very different population. She's teaching in a Greek primary school, so these are young learners. She showed the students some recorded authentic ELF communication, and she asked students to then reflect on their own language use after they watched it. And then she had them complete a task. So that's a similarity. We're having our students do some sort of task. And she observed that the students were using the strategies that they had observed when they communicated in the task. And then her students also reported that they felt more confident and they were more aware of the need for flexibility in communication. So this is a simpler way for younger learners of exposing them to communication strategies, raising their awareness, but not in such a cognitively demanding way like my intervention. The limitation here is there's no pre-data, so we don't really know to what extent the learners changed. But I think this still serves as a nice example of an activity that can be used in the language classroom. And finally, Milliner and Dmowski worked also with university students, but this time in Japan. They created their own video. So instead of going to like YouTube or Corpus, they actually made a video where they asked, I think it was their colleagues, if I remember correctly, to do a model of an information gap. So they actually did the task that the students then had to do. And they asked them to use communication strategies during this model. And so they did have a treatment and control group. The Treatment group did the task better. They were more accurate and they were faster. But in both groups, the communication strategy used was similar. And so this leads me to believe that implicit awareness raising, if you will, like just showing the video, maybe is not enough to bring most learners awareness. So I think that maybe some explicit awareness raising or some reflection, like Cordia did with her young learners, might be necessary to really have students notice and intentionally start to be aware and use communication strategies. But again, there's a good model here that the task can be modeled and you can make your own video instead of trying to find exactly what you want. Again, there was no pre-data, so we don't know to what extent people changed, but I think it's an interesting model. Okay, so I am not going to have 10 minutes for Q&A. I'm so sorry, but I'm so excited to share a lot of things with you. In terms of pedagogy, the first thing I've just presented is the idea of explicitly teaching ELF communication strategies. The second suggestion I will not spend as much time on, this is diversifying pedagogical models. So authentic ELF communication can be presented so that learners can analyze how meaning is negotiated. This is back to that Taguchi and Ishihara 2018 article. I really highly recommend it. So ELF corpora like I used, video streaming sites like YouTube, social media, teacher created recordings, all of these can be ways to distill down some language for students to analyze. Not only for explicitly teaching communication strategies, but also raising awareness of different norms, like how different speakers use silence or the level of directness that people use when they communicate. So sensitizing the students to this kind of variation. This can serve to destigmatize local variation, and we can also encourage learners to choose and to talk about their personal speaker role models. So probably most of our learners maybe have these role models, people that they admire for their English use, but we don't always surface that and talk about it. So this is an interesting article by Savova and Azarnush. They looked at who are the speaker role models that their participants who are LX English users tend to admire. And so they were looking at people with high intelligibility, but not L1 speakers, people who seemed likable, and people who were professionally accomplished. So not just random ELF speakers as role models, but like actually people that they know, maybe not personally, but they know who they are, and they want to emulate them. So this is related to learners' future self visions, which is also linked to imagined community. So what kind of English speaking community do they feel themselves a part of now and in the future? For what purposes do they use English now and in the future, and with whom? And then to surface that and discuss that and sensitize them to how their imagined community and their speaker role models can inform the sort of choices they make in terms of pragmatics and other things as well. But of course, I'm focused on pragmatic choices. Meta-pragmatic awareness raising. So explicit communication strategy instruction is an example of meta-pragmatic awareness raising, but we can do other things. So helping learners develop as ethnographers, like mini qualitative researchers, learners as ethnographers. So having students analyze their own interactions, having them generate, test, and revise hypotheses about pragmatically effective choices by observing other people as well as themselves. Keeping a journal of critical incidents. So critical incidents comes from the intercultural communication literature, but we can use it in terms of pragmatic communication as well. So when things go wrong, they can journal about that and think about what happened and why. When things go well, they can do the same. And finally, so those are kind of my pedagogical recommendations drawn from the literature about ways that we can bring ELF pragmatics into the language classroom. But finally, I think we also need to position this within a global English's language teaching paradigm in a larger sense. And so I just remind you or introduce to you, if you're not familiar with the GELT proposals from Rose and Galloway, these appeared much earlier, but the version I'm showing is from their 2019 book. And so they recommend increasing exposure to varieties of English in language curricula. And so my suggestions link with that, right? Diversifying the models, emphasizing respect for multilingualism, raising awareness about global Englishes. Students may not be aware of what the global reality of English is. raising awareness of ELF strategies. This is what I feel very strongly about. Emphasizing respect for diverse culture and identity, and also importantly, changing the English teacher hiring practices, because the more that students have teachers that they can relate to, teachers as models, as LX, as ELF, as global English as users, the more that they can see that local varieties work perfectly fine. That there's no need to try to emulate a so-called native speaker, whatever that means. So I'll end with some closing thoughts. English as a lingua franca is a sociolinguistic reality. It is the way that English is used in most of the world. So variation is the norm. Most English learners will use, if they're not already using English, with other LX speakers. This is the norm in most of the world. And so, as I said at the beginning of the talk, pragmatic effectiveness is crucial for successful ELF communication. Standardized English ideologies and expectations, of course, we cannot escape them, right? I am aware if you are a language teacher or a teacher educator, I know that this is impossible to escape. And so teachers do need to balance sometimes competing pedagogical aims and constraints. I know that here in China, where I teach, my teacher candidates in our MA TESOL program, they have to prepare their future students to take a standardized exam, at least more than one standardized exam, which requires standardized English, right? So my suggestion is that ELF-informed pedagogy can be additive, right? Not saying throw out the curriculum. I know that that's not realistic. But in service of students' real communicative competence and their confidence in their own communication, I think that it's important to infuse, not just as an add-on one lesson, but to infuse this ELF-informed pedagogy, these ideas that I and others have presented in today's talk, throughout all of the lessons to counter all of the standardized ideologies that they are receiving. And maybe over time, if I'm optimistic, little by little, we can start to shift the focus of ELT to be more inclusive and representative of the real world. So with that, if you are interested in checking out any of the papers that I've cited, these are the references. And I thank you so much for joining me and staying around for an hour to listen to me talk. That's a real privilege for me. I very much appreciate it. And if you are not in a rush to go, I'm also not in a rush if anyone has questions or comments that they want to share. Please feel free to email me anytime. And I'm going to stop.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Marcel. That was great. I learned so many things that I was not aware of. And we will talk about it later, maybe if we have time. I can see that there are some people who would like to ask questions. I saw somebody raise their hand earlier, but now I can't see anybody. You can either write in the chat, write your question in the chat, or you can speak up now. Um, if you have any questions or comments for our speaker.
Comments too. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, feel free to unmute and talk. Okay. Okay, well, there's something in the chat. Let me see. Oh, lots of people clapping. Thank you. That's very nice. 谢谢. Yes, Bukochi. I like the example with the German student in Korea. Yeah, I like this example too.
No one else is asking a question. I was wondering if there's any research on native speakers struggling with their pragmatics with non-native speaker comments.
This is my favorite question because this is the research I want to do. I don't want to get scooped, but this is the research I want to do. Because if you look at my TESOL quarterly article that I talked about at length in today's seminar, that included both L1 and LX users of English in the United States. So they were in mixed groups, right? And all of them, not every single person, but like both groups in terms of the mean, increased their understanding and their use of pragmatic strategies after the intervention, and it was statistically significant. So that tells me that those L1 speakers also have room to improve. And from my own experience, which is of course not evidence-based, but my own experience is that L1 English users are often the ones who are problematic in global English communication, because if you are in a global environment and you are used to communicating in a global environment like people are in other places, Malaysia, India, all of these other, even expanding circle, China, whatever, people eventually do develop, a lot of the time, their ability to use strategies and other pragmatic devices. But an L1 monolingual English speaker is often the one that comes into communication like a bull in a china shop and not really aware that they should be adjusting. They should be noticing their interlocutors, that they need to co-construct and negotiate meaning. Um, and so I do think that there is room for improvement. And I even think that it's maybe more important to train L1 speakers because they are the ones who are also often the gatekeepers. They are the ones who are saying, like, this is my language, you should speak this way. And that's actually not the case anymore, right? I am an L1 English speaker, but it's not really, it's my language when I use it, but it's not, I don't own that language. It's just English it's gone, it has its own life now, right? And so I think that training L1 English speakers in terms of global English's pragmatic competence can address ideologies and awarenesses as well as their ability for intercultural communication to improve. So I really am looking at doing that research. I have a project I'm aiming to start in the fall that looks at that as well. So yeah, I do think it's a good idea and we need to be doing it and seeing how it works.
And what's the response you get from L1 speakers? What do you say?
Well, the only response I have so far is 13 students in my pilot study, but they self-selected, right? They volunteered to be in the study. So it's maybe a biased group, but they really liked it. They thought it was really valuable. It really kind of blew their minds. They were so unaware of um, so many issues about communication, not only with people from other linguocultural backgrounds, but even with anybody, right? People, I think, are very unaware of the pragmatic choices we make because it's not something that's explicitly or talked about. And so they really liked it. I gave a survey at the end of the intervention, and it was almost 100% extremely positive responses. But, again, they self-selected. So maybe the people who most need it might be a little more resistant. I don't know. We'll see.
Thank you.
Oh, we have
Yeah,
somebody
thanks
who
for that
wants
question. I love that question. There's something else in the chat.
yeah.
Oh, Tim says, I lived in Korea for a few years and I'm still mortified about the one time I didn't use honorifics to an older person. My impression is that this is just simply rude in Korea. I think English might be a bit of a different case to this, though. Yeah, so right. This is the difficulty when we communicate interculturally, because what is rude for one person might feel appropriate for the other person. And what feels appropriate for that person feels rude to the other person. So that student in that study by Brown, who didn't want to use honorifics, may have offended people. And that is something, when we're teaching, that we can, when I teach, I haven't taught language in a while, but when I teach English, I usually will tell students when it comes to pragmatics, I am not telling you what to do, but I am telling you to be aware that the choices you make have consequences. So if you are communicating, if you are in the United States and you are writing an email to a professor at a United States university, there are some norms that you are expected to follow. You don't have to do that, but please be aware that if you don't, the professor may find you rude. And if you're okay with that, that's a speaker's choice, right? Teachers are not there to tell people what to do. I think we are there to provide options, right? Like giving a painter a set of colors that they can choose from. But in the end, they paint what they want. In the end, people say what they want. So yeah, for sure. I'm sure that people get offended in Korea by the lack of honorifics, but that's the choice that a speaker will make. I've also taught intercultural communication. I know there's no right and wrong culture. Culture is in the air and it takes time to understand. Yes. And yeah, Ivailo is referencing Hall's iceberg model that, yeah, this culture is always there, but we only see the very tip of it, for sure. From the perspective of a Japanese speaker of English, the potential difficulties Germans could face when using Korean are easy to envisage. In East Asian cultures, respect for seniority is of great importance, so awareness is very important, just like you said. Yeah, thank you, Mai, for bringing that up. Yeah, so these are the things we can raise awareness of, right? But if the speaker doesn't want to do it, I don't think we can force them. But then that's that idea of perlocutionary effect, right? If I don't show respect for elders in Japanese or in Korean, and then I find that I am pushing people away, then maybe as a speaker I change and I say, okay, I need to make peace with this. But that's something the speaker needs to do. They need to decide that themselves. Yeah. It's tricky. It's thorny, right? Because all of us have very deeply held beliefs about what's right and wrong, and we cannot easily change them out for something else, even if we know it's expected of us. And so, one of the things in that Taguchi and Ishihara 2018, I know I keep citing it, but I like that article so much. But one of the things they say at the end of the article is they draw on the field of peace linguistics, which is a very widely known area, but it is an area of research, peace linguistics. And they talk about trying to encourage learners of English, speakers of English, trying to encourage our students, if you're a teacher, to approach communication with a generous, open-minded spirit. I'm paraphrasing them, but this is my understanding. And so giving people the benefit of the doubt. So, if I'm speaking to a Korean person in Korean and I'm a learner and I don't use the honorifics, that maybe that person can look at me and say, that's a foreigner, that person's not a native speaker. Maybe she didn't mean to be rude, right? That we can all maybe extend the benefit of a doubt to people. And that's where that negotiation and co-construction comes in, right? My metaphor of testing the water, right? She said something rude, but maybe she didn't mean it that way. Let me see if I can repair this, if we can find a way to come to some sort of normative agreement between ourselves. So it is not easy, and therefore it's not easy to teach. And this is why I think pragmatics are not typically taught in general, right? People try to escape it because it's really complicated. But I think by raising awareness, we empower our students to make those choices.
I can see that we have
I
a
also teach in
person.
China.
We have a
Hmm?
person who raised her hand, I think.
Oh, yeah. Who's that? Oh, Jennifer. Yeah, yeah.
Hi. Hi. I just want to say thank you so much for this presentation. I found it really, really interesting. And I think that your research is really, really interesting and useful for people who are doing research in pragmatics with global Englishes and ELF. And I was just kind of going off what Mona was talking about and what you also just came back to it again with this where you were talking about the L1 or native English speakers, and sometimes I think it might be monolingual speakers. It might be like a multilingual ability, and then going to this what you just mentioned now about this peace. What was it?
Peace linguistics.
Peace linguistics, and sort of this willingness to. I mean, there's a phrase, there's a term, willingness to communicate, but more of a willingness to pragmatics and willingness to be flexible and to, accept these types of things, I think is really an interesting area. And then the awareness of becoming aware, students or speakers becoming aware of the different pragmatics choices that we have and the effects that they have. And then also this willingness to, negotiate and accommodate, I think, are two really key areas, I think, for future investigation. So it sounds really interesting, all of what you've done so far and what you're planning to do. So thanks so much. Just a comment, kind of.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that comment. Yeah, for sure. That's why I think the teaching, when you look at the course books and they give the lists of phrases, this is an easy way, right? I can see why people want a list, teachers and students both. It's very straightforward. But I think what you just said is the crux, right? Raising awareness, I think we don't have to tell students what to say, right? We can help them to raise their awareness about what people do say and the different ways that people say it, and they will find their own ways to say it. And that's a lifelong process.
Yeah.
So that's really like even a life skill, right?
Yeah,
That if you can raise awareness, not in a one-off, but if you can guide students over time by fusing the curriculum with a little bit, like a seasoning. I love the metaphors. What can I say? But you can use this kind of seasoning, then maybe over time, their way of thinking that towards communication, right? Their attitudes towards communication change. And I think that from my perspective, that's even more valuable than, you know, memorizing a list.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I know we're past time by about 15 minutes. So what do you think, Paolo? Should we
Yeah,
keep going? Should we end
yeah,
it?
I do have, I just want to comment on, I really liked the part of your study when you talked about the teaching, the part of teaching the communication strategies. I was quite impressed, and I'm a little bit angry that it came out so recently, because if it had come in 2021, I would have really benefited from it when I was doing my PhD. But yeah, I actually, because I had to take all communication strategies somehow to turn them into pedagogy, and there wasn't much back then, so I'm really happy to see a little bit more on it now. And I actually started to see communication strategies being more explicitly taught in textbooks, in one textbook, but
Mm.
I don't know if that was effective. I would really like to do more research in
Um,
this area, but I'm glad that there's more that we can get inspired from now. That's all I wanted to mention. But
Well,
yeah,
thank
we
you
can
for that.
definitely.
Actually, I was doing my PhD at the same time you were doing your PhD, which is why this didn't come out until 2025. So, but yeah, we do need more research for sure. So let's all get on it.
Absolutely. But yeah, I think we can end it here. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Before you go, I just want to remind everybody that next week, same time, we're going to have a workshop to follow up this seminar. And we're still going to have our speaker there. So if you want to join us next week, same time, we're going to have this workshop. We're going to send out the details about it soon on our website. You can register there, and we will keep you updated. Thank you again, Marcella, for everything today.